Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday of Ayn Rand's essays discussion. Today's essay is Consciousness and Identity. So, James, could you explain a bit what this essay is about? And could you tell us what Ms. Rand meant by identity more specifically?
Well, this essay is the final chapter in her extended monograph on concept formation and the role and function of concepts in epistemology. Now, that sounds pretty technical. It was published in the late 1960s and later republished, of course, in the print book forms of her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, which I highly recommend. And it is a cashing in on all those earlier chapters. But this chapter alone marks a revolution in human thought. And I do not, there's not a drop of hyperbole in what I mean there. This essay is, for the first time, a philosopher in human history has actually grappled with the fact that consciousness is a natural thing, that consciousness is not some supernatural ghost in the machine or some immortal spirit that lasts along our body, or the implications of what that mysticism wrought in human thought. For you see, the idea that consciousness possesses identity has been wrestled with since humans have been wrestling with the idea, the mystery of their own consciousness. Since primitive times, human beings thought consciousness was a mystical element, maybe a spirit that lived outside their body, as I say. And even when the Greeks came along to it, people like Plato couldn't understand the metaphysical status of ideas, of concepts, abstractions. He put them in a supernatural world of forms. Even Aristotle, who took the forms and out of a supernatural dimension and put them into things in this world, real natural things, he was putting them into things. Even he said that if consciousness were to possess identity, it would be a disqualifying feature. For you see, we'd sort of be blinded. All we would have is the appearances on us by implication. And of course, all of modern philosophy, Descartes and Locke, who began modern rationalism and empiricism, basically accepted this idea. They felt that sense perception itself, which gave us color and stuff, those colors were just an impact on our consciousness, not the thing in itself. And that what we need to do is have a pure and undiluted knowledge of the thing in itself, not merely its impact on us. So you see, instead of seeing color as the thing as perceived, they see it as merely an effect on us. So whether they call it the causal theory of knowledge or the veil of perception, perception was seen by them as an obstacle, as a veil, as a problem to getting to reality. And Hume and Kant really cashed in on that in a big way. Kant actually collapsed the distinction between the things that we perceive and any kind of reality. At least Descartes and Locke had this weird secondary primary distinction. This is the world as we perceive it, but these are the real things behind it. Kant collapses that altogether, says time and space, logic itself, are simply the way our mind has of looking at things. So the entire conceptual level of consciousness itself is disconnected from things as they are. As Ayn Rand brilliantly puts it, we're blind because we have eyes, deaf because we have ears, deluded because we have a mind, was in effect the final summary of this idea coming to full fruition under Kant. And since Kant, it's been a wrestle match with just that. Words are just vague resemblances of things maybe, and human conveniences at best. Ayn Rand is the first philosopher in human history to say that identity, the nature of consciousness, is a necessity. It's a natural thing. Everything possesses identity. To be is to possess identity, attributes, qualities, features, and that there is no separate existence even, according to Ayn Rand, apart from having qualities. If you don't have qualities, you don't exist. And there is no separate existence apart from the qualities that you possess. Existence is identity. Existence isn't some new feature, some paint of coat on something. So just like physical objects must possess an identity, they're natural entities. So consciousness, being a natural phenomenon, itself possesses identity and must possess identity, or it couldn't exist. And it must operate by a certain means, by a certain process. If it didn't operate by a causal means, it couldn't work at all. And so rather than regarding identity as disqualifying a feature, which in some sense all epistemologists before Ayn Rand believed, in some form, Ayn Rand turns the tables completely. No, it is the qualifying feature. Now, does consciousness have to operate? Can it do anything and get truth? No, it has to follow a very specific method. It has to be able to reduce to the evidence of sense perception. It has to form valid concepts. It has to use logic in a valid way. Objectivity requires a specific method and none other. And using that method assumes the identity of consciousness, requires the identity of consciousness. And so what we have here is a revolution, and a revolution that refutes both mysticism and skepticism, at least the general skepticism as philosophers have argued it, because every form of skepticism offered by philosophers has been in effect an argument that since we have a means, since there is a nature to consciousness, that's its disqualifying feature. We can never really know because we can never know reality undiluted, unfiltered, unprocessed by our consciousness. But it's also a refutation of mysticism, because mysticism is claiming, in effect, causeless knowledge. And all of these pseudo methods, I mean, it's sort of an implicit psychological recognition. We need some kind of method of knowing, but whether it's horoscopes, astrological charts, crystal balls, Indian tea leaf reading, mystical revelation, you name it. These are non-causal means of getting to reality. See, I know how my senses connect me to reality. I know how logic keeps me connected to reality. Those have a causal connection to reality. Mysticism claims either no cause whatever, no means are necessary, no nature of consciousness can be defined, it's a magical element anyway, or these pseudo means which really don't have anything to do with it. So the need for consciousness to have the recognition that consciousness possesses identity is a refutation, in effect, of both mysticism and skepticism simultaneously. That's how revolutionary this is. This is a monumental step in human knowledge, no less, a final coming to terms with the fact that consciousness is a natural phenomenon, and as such, like everything else, possesses an identity. And that identity, far from being the disqualifying feature of consciousness, is what makes it possible.
Thank you. I think you introduced several concepts which we might revisit later. So, for instance, skepticism or intrinsicism. But I would like to start with the beginning of the essay. And she starts talking about statements of propositions. And she, in the full book, she says that she won't talk about propositions, but that maybe we need to indicate some of its basic points. Why do you think that she used the issue of propositions as the introduction to this issue of consciousness and identity?
Well, for most of the monograph, she's explaining the relationship between concepts and the concrete reality in which they're based. And she was able to identify with precision the exact relationship between our abstractions and particulars, between the things that we perceive. A revolution that made this observation possible, by the way. But for her, concepts is what she's focused on, and the exact and precise meaning and the ability to give objective definition to concepts. Now, the next step in human knowledge, percepts, concepts, propositions. Well, the truth of our propositions hinges on exact meaning to concepts. Absent understanding what concepts actually refer to in reality and understanding the precision of what we're doing. Ayn Rand gave us exactly what makes concepts precise. But a proposition, a whole sentence, to put it in one way, a whole sentence obviously depends upon the validity of concepts. Absent the validity of concepts, none of our propositions could possibly be exact or valid. And she uses the analogy of mathematics. Can you imagine doing mathematics? Concepts are like words, in effect, to mathematical formulas. Can you imagine if mathematicians said, well, 5 usually holds as 5, but sometimes it can be 4 3/4. Sometimes it can be 6 1/2. Mathematics would be simply impossible. The whole point of the precision of mathematics would be destroyed, and the confidence of any of those equations would be absolutely annihilated. Well, the exact same holds true with words as numbers. And that's the way most people hold it. If you don't have Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, then concepts of sort of vague, guesswork, about that, that's sort of what we mean. If that's the case, then we're in the exact position of mathematicians saying, well, 5 can sometimes be 4 3/4 or 6 1/2. Precise concepts are absolutely what's required for precise and objective propositional logic. In fact, that's the primary precondition. Once we know what concepts are in reality, how they relate to reality, then our concepts have exact precision, just as numbers do in mathematics. And it's that important for the objectivity of our higher order abstract knowledge. The objectivity of all of our theoretical and highly abstract knowledge rests upon the objectivity of concepts.
Now, related to this, she talks about people, especially today, being unable to have a very clear mentality in regard to high degree abstractions, that they can only deal with very simple concepts such as book, or very perceptual level concepts.
Table, chair, ball.
Exactly. And could you give us some examples of this? And she also mentions that this kind of mentality is very common within the philosophical spheres. Could you give us an example of that?
Well, where the problem begins is that people treat first order concepts as they do sense perception. I look at an object and I see this table, say, and it's just this table that I'm seeing. I'm never seeing more than one. Well, I mean, maybe see more than one table, but I'm never seeing but the table in front of me, or the limited number of tables in front of me. Once I call it a table, once I call something a ball, I've gone beyond the perceptual. I'm actually relating my knowledge. I'm interrelating my knowledge. This thing here that I'm seeing, this table, is actually connected to every table that I might ever see. All the tables in the world, all the tables that have ever been, and all the tables that will ever be. So even just a first level concept is not like a percept. It's actually a concept. But because they're directly connected in a almost obvious way, and happen at the very first level of concept formation, people treat their first order concepts of perceptual objects, for example, as if they were percepts, not understanding that they are, in fact, concepts. And that when we build concepts, now the further away we get from the perceptual level, we build more abstract and more abstract concepts, abstractions from abstractions, as Ayn Rand explains in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. The further away from that, because people don't have a good grip on what concepts are or how they relate to concretes that we perceive, since they don't have a good grip on that, the further away from the perceptual realm we get, the higher order our concepts become, the more vague and approximate they become. And so, of course, when you come to higher, the examples are legion. Since you're asking for examples, we can treat concepts in effect like we treat those numbers over there. Oh yeah, well, this concept is sort of maybe, and sometimes, and in the sense you mean, and so that our concepts are sort of vague approximations based on vague resemblances, which is precisely how at one stage in his career, the famous 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein thought of abstractions as being. And that's as far along as this quest for what they mean, what our concepts mean, as we got before Ayn Rand. So the examples are legion with everywhere, but anytime you see someone, it can often be identified as an equivocation of concepts. But most people have no idea what even that means. And so they treat their concepts as sort of vague approximations. And that doesn't pose them a problem. They can go one instance calling a concept sort of this, and well, no, it's sort of that too. I think we all know how people treat concepts in that way in a million different ways.
So yesterday I was hearing Dr. Binswanger's video on Hume, and it was more on ethics. But afterwards, in the automatic play of YouTube, it came up a video of Hume's epistemology by some other philosopher. And he was saying that one of Hume's quest was to answer Descartes on the idea of getting clear and distinct ideas. And he claims that, for instance, this idea of consciousness as clear and distinct is crazy because you always perceive yourself doing something, like there's no I as such. Do you think that this could also be an example of this, of not getting clear and distinct ideas?
Sort of the idea, see, Hume was attacking the idea of necessary causation, or causation as it's generally understood. And we could never really get to this notion of causation as a clear and distinct idea. For him, the only clear and distinct ideas are, in effect, now this is, I am not Harry Binswanger, and I am not, I can't give you the exact, the outline in this, so I highly recommend people going to Harry Binswanger's work, books like How We Know and so forth, and his refutation of Descartes. I will tip my hat and give priority to that. But for Hume, it seems to me, and this is the standard reading of Hume, is that beyond first level, what Ayn Rand called for these first level abstractions that we're talking about, like table, chair, which he said, we can get clear and distinct ideas about that, but anything beyond that, like causality, any higher order abstraction beyond that, no, we can never have a clear and distinct idea about that. That's in effect what Hume is saying. Hume is a wonderful example in my mind of exactly what Ayn Rand was talking about when she was talking about people treating first level abstractions like they do percepts, and then dismissing in effect all higher order concepts as sort of vague and indistinct.
Could you relate? It does. Thank you very much. Could you relate this incapacity of people to thinking in broad categories of concepts with people with the notion that these people cannot introspect, or at least Ayn Rand claims that these people are unable to introspect? Why do you think she says that?
The only way we know we get introspective concepts, say concept like perception. Let's see, if I see the table, I'm seeing the table, but I'm also aware of the fact that I'm seeing the table. But seeing always comes with things like tables, balls, clouds, people, the things I'm seeing. If I hear something, right, I know I'm hearing it, but that never comes disassociated with a sound. My perception of a specific sound, oh yeah, that gunshot that I heard, bang, right? Hearing doesn't come apart. My awareness of hearing never comes apart from bangs that I hear. So both an awareness of my hearing and awareness of seeing always comes with the external object. Always comes with the external object. Introspection is impossible if I can't identify the different features of my consciousness: sense perception, concept formation, logic, memory. There are all these distinct functions going on in my mind, but they're never separate from the object itself. And so my introspective awareness, introspective self-evidency, is no different than the self-evidency of what I'm seeing. That I'm seeing is just as obvious as what I'm seeing. And without understanding that relationship, again, between existence, identity, and consciousness, you're going to be completely lost. You're going to be completely lost. You can't engage in introspection. And if your more abstract concepts are always vague and inexact, then the contents of your own consciousness must, perforce, be inexact, must be a mystery to you. Must be a mystery to you. So it's going to induce internal confusion if you don't understand the identity of your consciousness and how you identify its parts, which are never separate, in effect, from the actual extrospection that we're engaged in.
Definitely. Thank you.
Sure.
Regarding the needs or necessities of her world, she said that there was needed a Herculean philosophical effort of cleaning up the Kantian stables. What does it mean? What would it mean to do that? And do you think that today's world have the stables been cleaned up a bit better? Do we have better cleaners, or is it worse than in the 50s and
Yes.
60s?
We have some, at last, better cleaner on the stage. Ayn Rand. We have Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, and the very monograph, and which is the final section of, is the first step in that Herculean effort. Is the Hercules. Now, the impact is still fully to be. Leonard Peikoff's who are going in that Hercules. But just the outline that I think I showed you from the ancient religious viewpoint that consciousness is some spiritual, mystical that really doesn't belong to her and doesn't have an identity. The idea that, well, does have an identity, that would be a disqualifying feature. We need to see reality pure and undiluted and uncausally for it to be true perception, beginning with Aristotle, going all the way through to the founders of modern philosophy, like Descartes and Hume. But then, on top of all that confusion, and even all of that confusion reached a worse state of confusion, a systemization of the error that identity is a disqualifying feature that Kant gave us. And since then, in effect, philosophy has, while they may explicitly reject Kant in a dozen different ways, the basic idea that consciousness is disqualifying. Or take, for example, in 20th century physics, the act of measuring a subatomic particle distorts our understanding of that, our perception of that subatomic particle, influences that. Pure Kantian kind of arguments. So we are thick, over the last 200 years, we are thickly mired in a post-Kantian world that says our concepts really aren't exact descriptions of the world around us. So it requires a Herculean effort to undo not only Kant's monumental institutionalization of this error, but all of the forms in which that error has sprung up. And you can see it all the way to our time. But do we have Herculeses out there who are attempting to fix it? Yes, we do. But it's got to start with epistemology. It's got to start with methodology. It's got to start with the acknowledgement that the possession of identity is what makes consciousness a real, is the qualification that makes it a real thing. It couldn't be real if it didn't have it. We perceive by a specific means. We perceive in a certain form. Objectivity beyond sense perception. Well, the term does not apply to sense perception, but all of our conceptual knowledge needs to be objective, i.e. follow a specific method. And even sense perception, which is non-volitional, is perception of reality, even though it's perception by our means, So yes, this is the monumental task ahead of us. And I would say that Dr. Peikoff's further examination of epistemology, his work on induction, I would say that Harry Binswanger's book, How We Know, that's part of the Herculean effort of trying to undo this gigantic error that was so institutionalized by Immanuel Kant and that we've been drowning in ever since.
In the same essay, she talks about brain drain from humanities, and she mentions that this escape, the escape of people going from the humanities to the sciences, is illusory. Why does she think that?
Excuse me, I missed the first part of your question.
she mentions that the brain drain is.
Oh, yes. The impact of philosophy was first felt in the humanities and can be felt in the humanities dramatically. It has turned the whole realm of the humanities into a necessarily subjective area. We don't know what we're doing, in effect, has been the upshot of philosophy, a self-declared bankruptcy, whereas the success in the physical sciences has been enormous. Look at the giant strides that men like Galileo, Newton, Maxwell made to our understanding of the physical world. They were successful in induction. They had exact ideas and could reduce them actually to numbers in effect. But even science cannot escape the attack on epistemology. And you can see it in the theoretical, much at least of the theoretical physics over the last 100 years. They dive into total subjectivism. Could reality all be some matrix or some illusion created, or could consciousness be behind it all? Total mysticism. Or, as I say, even if it's the simple idea of the fact of measuring distorts the outcome of any measurement. All of those are Kantian ideas influencing science. And so it is illusory, even though the humanities are in a terrible state of non-objectivity, and even though the physical sciences look like they're doing a far better job with it, epistemology must, at the end of the day, destroy science too. I think there's no way around it. Philosophy is the subject which tells us whether or not how reason works, why it works, and whether or not it's, actually any denial, any real skepticism is denial of the axiom of consciousness, but it requires philosophical defense against these skeptics. And all of it comes down to that. If philosophy doesn't get the ideas of epistemology squared away, the rest of human knowledge must suffer as a direct result. And it's only a matter of time.
When I was studying my PhD, one of the things that made me extremely uncomfortable, and one of the reasons I left, was because I knew that all the research that I could do was related to very small things. Like in economics, 50 years ago, you would study the labor market, but now you study the labor market in Walmart, in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s decade, something like that. And it's extremely boring for me.
Well, notice the higher the abstraction, the broader your theory, the more suspicious they are of it. The more it must necessarily be vague and not real, and it's obviously missing something. So what we have to do is reduce our vision, and that's what really happens when you do this, right? You reduce your vision straight down to the most concrete, and you really can't, like Dr. Peikoff says, you can't talk about free trade generally when you're talking politics, right? It's political discussions quickly reduced to, well, forget about Ricardo and, the law of comparative advantage or something, and how tariffs always hurt the country imposing. Now we can't talk at that level. No. How about Japan? Japan, should we have a tariff on Japan? Well, no, we can't really discuss tariffs on Japan. It has to be the auto industry. And if it's not the auto industry, well, how about Toyotas versus Datsuns in the United States? Should we impose a tariff on Toyotas? And it narrows the scope of our vision. It's anti-conceptual, so that we're actually narrowing our vision down to the little finest concretes. That's the direct impact on the assault on the conceptual level of consciousness.
And it's extremely boring.
And it's extremely boring, apart from being not very helpful and not getting at any general principles. Yeah.
Let me thank Jeff Bannister for his super chat, and also Bonnie for her both her super chats. One of them has a question, and she says, maybe off topic, but do we know when she hyphenated the word concept formation?
The use of the hyphen has been discouraged since Ayn Rand wrote. Over the last few decades, the hyphen in English has just sort of been pushed out now further. Now we rarely put hyphens in, right? But if two ideas were required to be put together to form really a single idea, they just put a hyphen in there. Sense perception, right? But I think it's no more than just the current linguistic convention of doing without hyphens that makes us notice, boy, she put hyphen in there. I think it's that simple.
I didn't know that. So I think one of the crucial aspects of this essay, I mean, the whole ITOE, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, is that she's proposing not only a positive epistemology, but also a normative one, something that might, I'm not a scholar on epistemology, but my understanding is that since Kant, it has become, it was a dead science. why do men need philosophy? Sorry, epistemology, and what is Rand's view on that?
Well, see, that's just exactly it. Sense perception is automatic. It doesn't, as such, sense perception is automatic. I look, I see, it takes me no effort. I don't need to follow any specific method. I just look and see. Once my eyes, have developed the capacity to perceive things as objects, and that happens automatically. I don't remember that even happening in my head. But once that happens, perception is a totally just automatic, unvolitional. It's before we even get to volition. Concepts, in sharp contrast, are a volitional method of consciousness. And so the operation of our mind at the conceptual level has to be self-conscious and self-directed. We have to discover a correct means of knowing. Horoscopes are not a correct means of knowing. Logic is a correct means of knowing. We need the concept of objectivity. We need to discover how to know. We need, at the conceptual level, we need to discover how to check our knowledge, how to validate our knowledge. What is objectivity as such? We need to follow logic. We need to avoid logical fallacies, for example. So we need epistemology precisely because we can't just know any old how. Any old means won't do it. I can't just throw darts at a newspaper to see what the truth is about the stock market the next day, can I? And so we absolutely need epistemology to develop. Remember, for logic was a discovery, a human discovery. The principles of deductive logic were discovered more than 2,300 years ago by Aristotle. But the modern scientific method of a controlled experiment, that's only as old as, Galileo or Francis Bacon, only in recent centuries. We need to learn how to learn. And objectivity is a critical concept for human beings at the conceptual level. That's why we need epistemology. It's precisely because only a specific method can get us the truth. Only by following a specific process can we actually acquire truth and know that we've gotten truth, as opposed to some error or some fantasy that we wanted to come to. So the idea that we have to have processed knowledge is a condition, a causal condition for knowledge, not a disqualifying feature of it for Ayn Rand. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And related to that, there is this idea of mentioning that one must distinguish between the what one knows and the how does one know it. And she mentions also that historically, there have been schools that answer the what, but they don't answer the how, or that they answer the how, but they don't answer the what. Could you explain us which of these schools, or what these schools are, according to her categorization?
Objectivists call it intrinsicism and subjectivism. Intrinsicists say we can know, but that how is a problem. And so what we need is consciousness needs in effect to be empty. As one philosopher put it, diaphanous. It has to be nothing in effect, but we get reality and we get it pure. We get it by some intuitive insight, some mystic revelation, a la Plato or something. Or we have the subjectivists, or our intrinsicists include religious people who say they get it from a religious revelation. Then you've got your subjectivists who say, well, no, consciousness needs a how, and that how's the very problem. Since we each have a how, and since we each have a perspective, there's no universal truth here at all. We've got how, but the how prevents us from knowing the what. And then the intrinsicists who say, no, we have this mystic intuition, or we have this mystic revelation, so we get the what, and we get the what's directly. But that requires that we not have a how. And so in general terms, the conflict between intrinsicists and subjectivists is over this very issue. If we have a how, we can never really get to the what. Identity is an obstacle. If we have the what, then we must not have a how, because that would have been an obstacle. Or it must be an ineffable, a magical how, you see. Does that make sense?
It does, it does. And also related to this, she mentions that there is a psychological root to these theories, that there is a reason why they don't try to grasp or try to answer at least one of these two questions. Could you comment what is the answer that she gives?
Ultimately, they want their abstract solutions not to have to be their abstract ideas not to have to be reduced to the perceptual level. They want their ideas to be left into this vague realm. It is precisely the same psychological motives that existed behind both intrinsicism and subjectivism. I want reality to be the way I want it to be. They don't get the reality they want it to be. They will be, unfortunately, constrained to reality if they follow objectivity and have to follow a specific causal means, and only the causal means that can get them to connect to reality. The fact that identity the consciousness has an identity is in fact the obstacle to their cherished dreams, whatever they are. What I want to believe, if I want to believe in God, or if I want to go by my own personal subjective way, this consciousness having an identity is a problem, because it'll tell me truth is available, but only if I go by a certain means, objectivity. That's the enemy. That's the enemy, psychologically speaking, if you want to, at the end of the day, believe whatever it is you are emotionally wedded to believing.
Related also to psychology, we have Bunny with another question who asks, do you think it's important to separate epistemology from psychology and neuroscience? Which informs which? Can they be blended?
Well, the first thing I would say that whatever psychology or neuroscience tells us about consciousness will simply be beliefs about consciousness. And so epistemology's got to come first. And yes, epistemology must be distinguished from psychology. If we don't get the objectivity question right, if we don't define the valid means of knowing, we don't have that down square pat, we can't get neuroscience. Whatever we learn about the brain will just be another state of consciousness. Our science about the brain is just a science, and science has to follow a certain method, and science is only knowledge. It's only a method of knowing, a process of knowing, a state of consciousness, if you will. And whatever we learn about neuroscience will be no more valid than the epistemology that philosophy gives us. It'll just be another state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Same with psychology. Same with psychology. And yes, we must distinguish psychology from epistemology. Epistemology's got to come first. Epistemology's got to come first for any science. For any science. All science is just, as I say, a process, a state of knowing. It will only be, whatever we learn in any topic will only be a state of consciousness. So until we get this understanding of consciousness, its relationship to reality, and its status as a natural thing, none of that will really help. Now, will psychology and neuroscience provide us additional information that might be helpful? Absolutely. Absolutely. It is, in fact, the discovery that there's some kind of natural physical, mechanism behind consciousness, our brain and its operation, that helps us understand consciousness as a natural phenomenon. But it can only add, it can only buttress. It can only buttress, and it can be no more solid than our epistemology was in the first instance. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So one of the most interesting comments of the essay, of at least this chapter, is that she says that the revolt against consciousness is a revolt against life. Why does she think that?
Beyond this perceptual level, our only way of knowing anything is through concepts, the conceptual level of knowing. That's our only real way of knowing. Further, it is not an impractical, first, it is a volitional thing beyond the sense perceptual level, as I say. It is a chosen thing. It takes effort to think. We have to, in effect, put the effort into doing it, and to doing it right, being objective. So it has so how we do it morally responsibly, how we use our minds in a morally responsible way, is the only thing that's going to get us objective knowledge. Furthermore, objective knowledge is a precondition for successful action. As John Galt says, before I can act, I've got to know. I've got to have some confidence in that knowing. My only means of acting successfully, my most fundamental means of survival is my consciousness. So there is a practical upshot to survival. I can neither know nor successfully act if I do not choose to use my consciousness in the correct manner. So, yes, this is a matter of life and death, practical consequences. Can I know? Can I act successfully in reality? And all of that hinges on this very question.
When I read most of the essays that we have discussed of Philosophy Who Needs It, I read it through the lens of this essay. I mean, seeing consciousness as a natural phenomenon, and it's quite a theme in the whole book. And one of the thoughts that it came to me was that if we got the Industrial Revolution from the idea that we can make material reality according to science, then what could we be doing if we could take consciousness as a natural phenomenon? Maybe the conscious revolution will come.
Indeed,
I don't know
it's
what.
a Copernican revolution. Bigger than Copernicus's. This is a Copernican revolution in human thought. This is a Copernican revolution in human thought. It is on that scale. Ayn Rand is truly the first philosopher to fully grasp that consciousness is a perfectly natural phenomenon, and that being a natural phenomenon isn't its disqualifying feature that it operates causally and by a certain means and in a certain form, which she was the first with respect to concepts to understand and identify. It's, to put it this way, I know this may relate to something else you wanted to talk about later, but she uses the concept process in a very interesting way. No one would say, for example, that if we were eating food, right, that our body has to process that to get the nutrition from it, right? No one would say that the need to process food, i.e. digest food, was an obstacle to nutrition and our body getting the nutrients it needs. No, they would say, no, the processing of it, the digestion of the food, is a necessary causal precondition of it. In fact, there could be no way I could magically, by some osmosis, get the nutrition from food without that digestive process. Moreover, rocks can't give me nutrition. Poison will kill me. All kinds of things I can't, that are simply not nutritious, and all kinds of things that are anti-nutritious. Now, compare that to knowledge. Knowledge is the same sort of thing. It's as if they're saying that processed knowledge is disqualified knowledge. But as Ayn Rand points out, if I were to do the exact same analogy here, right, they're saying, well, because processed knowledge is a disqualifying feature, you can eat rocks, you can eat poison. Well, that would be the exact equivalent. No, objectivity is our only means at the conceptual level of knowing, and knowing with certainty. We cannot simply digest anything and process it. There are rocks and poison in the epistemological sense out there. And unless we appreciate the identity of consciousness and the necessity, therefore, of a specific method, i.e. objectivity, we're still going to be eating rocks and poison.
Thank you. Let me thank Jeff, and maybe related to, sorry. Let me thank Jeff for his very generous super chat again.
Thank you.
So related to what you've just mentioned, I don't know if you have anything else to say, because I think you already mentioned the idea of Kant related to this idea that identity disqualifies consciousness as a valid tool of cognition. Do you have anything else to say about this?
Well, We are absolutely mired in this world which cannot has not really come to terms with the fact that consciousness is a natural phenomenon. We are not past the primordial ages of ancient superstition and medieval religion and this idea of consciousness being a supernatural element or something, or that some kind of physical mechanism or some kind of conscious mechanism of objectivity is required to get knowledge. And the great upshot of all this, and the final word I would have on all this, is that with one clear observation, Ayn Rand has laid waste both mysticism and skepticism in one gigantic blow. Once fully grasped, all the previous arguments that we cannot really know, or all the previous arguments that says we don't need objectivity to know mysticism, are both refuted simultaneously in one fell swoop by Ayn Rand's simple recognition of the natural fact of consciousness, and that consciousness is a natural fact. It is a mechanism for knowing, and it is a means of survival that has evolved in a certain biological organism. It is a very natural phenomenon. It has this very specific survival value to that organism which has it as its means of survival and its means of knowing. And when you understand that, it grounds knowledge as objective, if we're doing it objectively, and it grounds knowledge for the first time against the arguments simultaneously of both mystics and skeptics. Nothing short of a total revolution in epistemology. We're living in a totally new world, and the day that a large number of philosophers grasp Ayn Rand's revolutionary insight here, we will be living in a whole new world.
Definitely. Well, I thank you for another brilliant discussion, James.
Well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And I thank also the super chatters, Bonnie
Yes.
and Jeff, for their very generous contribution as well. And I also thank the members. I don't know if you want to comment more on that, James.
I do. You know, we now not only can you easily subscribe, like, share, and please do, and think about commenting too, but you can now hit that join button once you've subscribed. And if you do that, it'll give you an easy means of becoming a subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. And once you do that, you're going to get all kinds of additional perks. We have on Sundays, for example, I'm helping lead workshops on Dr. Leonard Peikoff's also revolutionary, monumental work in my mind, The Ominous Parallels, The End of Freedom in America. And we've just started it. So if you subscribe now, you can get in on the ground floor and participate in our Sunday. And you can really participate in our Sunday discussions of Leonard Peikoff's Ominous Parallels. So please do consider joining and becoming a paid subscriber to ARCUK. Keep the lights on around here if you enjoy this programming and if the ideas of Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff are of interest to you.
And if you become a YouTube member, you will get access to James's Omnius Parallels recording on the first session.
Yes.
So another good reason to subscribe to James. Sorry. Well, thank you very much. See you next Tuesday.
Thank you, Alejandro. Next Tuesday.